I'm delighted to welcome you to this edition, this session. Our speakers in this order of appearance are Mara Mills, who is Associate Professor of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University and works at the intersection of disability studies and media studies. Her publications include On the Phone, Hearing Loss and Communication Engineering, and her concept is Impairment. Our other speaker, Iris Montero, is visiting assistant professor of Hispanic Studies at Brown and an historian of early modern science and medicine. Her current book project, What the Hummingbird Knows, explores the transference of knowledges between indigenous communities in the Americas and communities of naturalists in Europe. Her concept is Scala Naturae. I welcome Mara to begin.
I'll read.
Please do.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see old colleagues and friends. Okay, so impairment. Impairment is a central concept, as some of you know, in Anglophone disability studies, referring to physical difference, limitation, or injury. Disability, by contrast, is understood to be social, the result of such factors as stigma or architectural and design exclusions. Yeah, I'll be the second person to do this. Thank you, Stephanie, for leading the way. Regarding human bodies, impairment superseded the prior term defect in English around 1920 against the backdrop of creeping medicalization and anthropometry, industrial hygiene and scientific management, workers' compensation, and later veterans rehabilitation, statistics, and the publication of new medical guides for the rating of injuries. And some of those topics I'll address in the next 30 minutes, but of course not all of them, and none of them thoroughly. So this terminological shift from defect to impairment is evident from a review of canonical British and American textbooks, which I've done, especially otological textbooks. But you can also see the rising popularity of the term impairment starting around 1920, really 1940, from the ambiguous evidence here of Google Ngram. Unlike defect, impairment was identified with function and always tethered to its counterpart, repair. Within disability studies, the impairment-disability couple is usually attributed to the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, a British activist group that published a manifesto defining these terms in 1976, titled Fundamental Principles of Disability. This document states, "What we are interested in are ways of changing our conditions of life, and thus overcoming the disabilities which are imposed on top of our physical impairments by the way this society is organized to exclude us." So if you're familiar with disability studies, you'll know that recent work contests, and work by people like Alison Kafer, who Joanna brought up, contests the tidy physical social division between impairment and disability, which has deflected scholarly attention from embodied constraints such as pain and fatigue. In response to these criticisms, some authors have proposed new vocabulary or new theories for the field of disability studies. My colleague at NYU, Julie Livingston, uses the term debility to encompass impairment, chronic illness, and the universal process of senescence. Tobin Siebers suggests that the social construction model of disability be replaced by a new realism of the body that foregrounds human variation. As it turns out, though, the medical field itself began to distinguish between impairment and disability early in the 20th century. Even within the medical model, moreover, impairment was always defined according to social factors, namely industrial labor, which may explain the longstanding intractability of this term for disability theory, the term impairment. In 1948, as one example, the U.S. Veterans Administration collaborated with the Bureau of Labor to draft a definition of impairment to guide the rehabilitation of injured soldiers. Their report concluded that the basic concept of impairment is a physical disability severe enough to constitute a problem for the individual in obtaining employment. The American Medical Association has differentiated between impairment and disability at least since the publication of their first Guide to the Evaluation of Permanent Impairment in 1958, with impairment defined as a significant deviation, loss, or loss of use of any body structure or body function, measured in degrees, and this is me quoting from the AMA guide, according to which the impairment decreases an individual's ability to perform common activities of daily living. And these activities are largely social. They include travel, self-care and hygiene, sensory function, communication, and by communication they include writing, typing, as well as seeing, hearing, speaking, sleep, and sexual function. Reviewing the history of the AMA guides in her 1984 book, The Disabled State, Deborah Stone concludes that the professional concept of impairment represents an effort to define and quantify the elements of inability to work. So hardly just physical. Even today, the rating of impairment and the selection of traits for inclusion in the AMA guides are as much social as physical. The AMA continues to take into consideration a combination of statistical norms and workplace functions. So loss of a major portion of the nose, for instance, counts for as much as 50% impairment of the whole person. It is judged to be a, quote, disfigurement so severe that it precludes social acceptance, even if it does not impact function at all. Okay, so despite the significance of impairment as a keyword in disability studies, and despite decades of debate about its definition, which have come to a head in recent years, almost no work has been done to explain the roots of this concept as it came to be understood in English in the modern period. In fact, impairment became an increasingly common term across fields ranging from medicine to life insurance to engineering toward the end of the 19th century. Earlier in the century, defect was the preferred term for atypical anatomy or atypical function, and historian Douglas Bainton has written on that. Unlike defect, impairment was generally referenced in degrees, emphasizing a functional loss and a continuum approach to bodily traits rather than a binary one. In How Our Days Became Numbered, Dan Book, and Dan, if you're watching and I'm pronouncing your last name wrong, I'm really sorry. He traces the links between the new category of impairment and the life insurance industry in the period between 1890 and the 1910s, when 1/9 of the American population would enroll in life insurance and thus encounter this discourse. Impairment, he argues, offers a statistical lens to predict and later control risk. It encompassed any class of risks, he writes, without worry too much about medical tradition, risks ranging from ailments to disabilities to errors of diet. So for life insurers, impairment could refer to, and this is in Dan's words, a history of tuberculosis in the family, overweight, a taste for beer, or childhood illness. Other historians have instead emphasized workers' compensation policies, which followed on the heels of the life insurance movement in the US as a spur for the popularization of the word impairment. In her recent award-winning book, No Right to be Idle, The Invention of Disability, Sarah Rose argues that the term disability acquired its modern connotation as an umbrella category for a previous miscellany of conditions by the end of World War I, when it began to be associated with inability to work or lack of productivity. She argues that this was an irony and an unintended consequence of workers' compensation, which led most employers to require pre-employment health screenings by the 1920s to eliminate people with various impairments from the workplace, where they were now, because of workers' comp, suddenly imagined to be inefficient, careless, and likely to become disabled and incur future compensation costs. This is her, I'm reducing her beautiful book to a real nutshell right there. I recommend reading it. She really is historicizing disability, not impairment, though. So in this context, impairment became an explanation for reduced work capacity. As an aside, the term capacity itself only came to mean ability to produce. as well as ability to contain around 1900. Linked to capacity, impairment could be quantified, rated with regard to significance, ameliorated with technical aids if deemed significant, or if irreparable and caused by a workplace injury, compensated monetarily. And that, of course, is what the employers were hoping to avoid. So no detailed history yet exists of the ways an industrial medical department in a particular firm defined, quantified, tested, and then excluded or compensated for particular impairments. Historians have paid scant attention to industrial medicine, which is, for the last several decades, been far overshadowed by social medicine. But it is there in the early 20th century that the current medico-legal definition of impairment actually takes shape. So I want to offer you one such example today, and at the same time, I want to show that the discourse of impairment extends much more widely than at first might be thought, far beyond human bodies. Perhaps surprisingly, impairment became entrenched in telecommunications and subsequently digital media at the same moment in the industrializing United States. So a virtually non-existent word in 1800, impairment began to appear sporadically in telecommunications as a descriptor of signal quality by the end of the century. It was formalized around 1920 by American Telephone and Telegraph, the largest corporation in the world at that time and for most of the 20th century, and broadly influential company. When impairment, again in the 1920s, began appearing as a chapter title or index heading in the first handbooks of communication engineering, which was a then emergent field. By the 1930s, telephone engineers had identified noise, distortion, and attenuation as the principal transmission impairments, which in turn seemed to handicap talkers and listeners. The category of transmission impairment remains embedded in communication engineering today as the discipline has become global and branched into video, data, and mobile applications, spurred in no small part by developments at the research branch of AT&T, Bell Labs, such as information theory, the transistor, and cellular switching. Just to give you one little piece of evidence, this image is taken from a 2016 textbook on digital communications, and it shows the cumulative effects running from top to bottom of the image of the impairments of attenuation, distortion, interference, and noise upon a non-specific signal. Although English has become the lingua franca of engineering in recent years, this concept of transmission impairment has also now appeared in other languages. I haven't done the etymology on this. I should, or maybe someone else should. But the German term for transmission impairment, for instance, forgive my pronunciation for all the time I've spent in Germany, good God, is Übertragungsstörung, with Störung referring to disorder or dysfunction. That term appears in the German term for borderline personality disorder, among other things. Okay, so I'll briefly suggest today that the telecommunications industry and its massive branch of industrial medicine in the US were central to the popularization of the discursive category of impairment across bodies and signals in the 19-teens and 20s, and that in both cases, hearing impairment emerged at the forefront of this discourse. Again, this is not to say that the word impairment wasn't being used before. It comes up in life insurance, it comes up in telegraphy, but it's that jetting up of the term, if we can trust Google Ngram at all, but certainly we can trust, I think, more the medical textbooks that I've looked at between the 1920s and the 40s, I think can be linked. I'm going to locate it in AT&T, this largest corporation in the world, in industrial medicine too. Okay, so where was I? The unlikely discursive conjuncture between medicine and communications can more precisely be explained by substantial links between the field of public health in the US and the Bell system. Bell system being the umbrella for AT&T, its manufacturing branch, Western Electric, which for a long time ran the largest factory in the world at Hawthorne Works, and later Bell Labs. Specifically, the management at AT&T hoped to design telephones for the average talker and listener, employing psychophysics and later a more wide-ranging human factors engineering, and they hoped to precisely calculate percentages of hearing loss to curb employee injury claims. Okay, so some details about this example. In 1913, in the midst of the so-called compensation era in the US, which followed the passage of the first statewide workmen's compensation law in 1902. Of course, there was workers' comp in England and in Germany before this. AT&T established a medical department and employee benefits. It was one of the first large companies in the US to do so. Historian Jill Cooper attributes this move to three advantages for AT&T. First, industrial physicians screened out applicants with pre-existing impairments or diseases, whereas the company still appeared fair for compensating or reintegrating those injured on the job. Second, they provided health advice to each worker with the aim that, and this is a quote from Cooper, his life as a producing unit is prolonged to the maximum. And third, they conveyed a benevolent image of AT&T at a time when the corporation was advancing to monopoly status and when it was widely criticized for negative health impacts of telephone work, especially on female operators. So the management of veterans after the First and Second World Wars has received substantial scholarly attention as a wellspring of present-day disability policy, rehabilitation, biopolitics, but much, much less has been written on the history of workers' comp, which dates to an earlier period and in fact influenced rehabilitation. It influenced military policies. In both sectors, the impairment of earning capacity was portrayed as the principal disadvantage of physical impairment. AT&T physicians sat on the Conference Board of Physicians in Industry, established in 1914 and positioned at the forefront of debates about the medical definition of impairment, the need for widespread health screenings, and the handling of workers' comp in the US. As AT&T Medical Director C.H. Watson explained at a 1922 meeting of the National Industrial Conference Board, the field took inspiration from engineering and, in particular, the testing that was part of quality control. I'm not going to say that much about quality control here, and some of you have heard me talk about that before, but it's like another very important thread alongside industrial medicine underlying, and then life insurance being a third one. So he wrote in 1922, the plant engineer, after passing upon the integrity of newly acquired equipment, periodically carries out an inspection to determine its efficiency, its rate of depreciation, and its relationship to the other portions of the plant with which it must coordinate its functions. The same logic applies to the human plant equipment, hence the physical examination of the employee in all its phases. I just love that the employee is in it. Those phases began with hiring and ended with accident rehabilitation. In the copious medical department, personnel department, and benefit plan records in the AT&T archives, which I closed the books on in February after like 11 years of research in the AT&T archives, there are endless circulars and guidelines for employee examinations from the 1910s and 1920s. In a 1926 pamphlet from the Bell System General Health Course Conference, just to give you one tiny detail from this collection, author T.P. Sylvan reflected back on the mutual escalation of health examinations among the largest American corporations in those years in an effort among each of them to capture the best human material, as they put it. Naturally, with the advent of medical departments in large industries, he wrote, it was necessary for our company to establish a department because we could not hope to draw from the average of humanity if we were the only corporation that had no regular medical exam required for entrance. In 1919, the former medical director of the Bell System Eastern Group, John Billings, published an article in the American Journal of Public Health on the need for standards for recording and classifying defects and impairments. He was the son of John Shaw Billings, the director of the Surgeon General's Library, National Library of Medicine now, and the Vital Statistics branch of the census. The senior Billings had famously encouraged Herman Hollerith to develop a punch card system to analyze census data, now a landmark in the history of automated computing. The article by the younger Billings was recognized by contemporaries for offering an early and overt distinction between impairment and defect. So the people in the Bell System were theorizing what impairment might be, even as they were trying to delimit it and define it through things like quality control testing and inspection. And in his article, he also attempts to standardize and grade the various types of defect and impairment. Defects, he insisted, should be considered a ubiquitous feature of human existence rather than antitheses to the norm. Impairments were defects that interfered with performance to varying degrees and required immediate attempts at correction. Some would ultimately be correctable and others not. In later years, the term defect disappeared, and those impairments not amenable to correction or compensation would, from the medical perspective, be considered disabilities. Okay, so the category of transmission impairment was simultaneously formalized same exact years within the first communication engineering textbooks published by AT&T to explain, as I mentioned, phenomena such as noise, crosstalk, distortion, and overload. The phrase transmission impairment had appeared in publications on telegraphy in the 19th century, but it's not used at all with any frequency before 1870, and examples were not classified or systematically investigated until the 1920s, 1930s. Transmission impairments later migrated into television and video from speech transmission, and later still, as you saw in that previous slide, into digital media. This is just a comparison between unimpaired and impaired television signals from the 1959 edition of Transmission Systems for Communications, published by Bell Labs. The broadest category of telecommunications impairment always was, and is still, noise. Early telephones picked up and amplified sounds from the earth, the atmosphere, the weather, and the network itself. They generated interference with the surrounding electroscape of telegraph and power wires and other electroacoustic equipment. For instance, in New York City, at least in the 19-teens, a brief-lived telharmonium music transmission system, which historians of electronic music love to discuss, and which sent piped electronic music, unwanted electronic music into people's homes through their telephones. Telephones calls were also marked by lots of other kinds of loss imposed by every single element of the system: vanishing volume, lost frequencies, just dropped calls. Speech sounds span up to 8,000 hertz for English, with consonants like S and F occupying higher frequencies, but the frequency range of the first telephone was estimated to be just 1,000 hertz, so loss. To improve the design of the early carbon telephone transmitter, which was noisy and inefficient to the point of causing situational hearing loss, and to understand the impairments of attenuation and interference occurring over telephone lines, Western Electric, again, this is the manufacturing branch of the telephone system, established a research unit in New York in 1911. It just turned into Bell Labs in 1925, same place, same equipment, same people. Many things that are attributed to being invented at Bell Labs really actually, as a pure research institute, actually came out of Western Electric Labs, which was a manufacturing research institute. And I think in terms of political concepts and thinking about thinking about capitalism, this is very important, that the roots of this industrial research that had a pure research component really was about manufacturing at first. So first directed by Irving Crandall and later by Harvey Fletcher, the transmitter research team set out to understand how telephone quality should be defined. The group determined that their design objective for the telephone transmitter was economic quality. As Western Electric assembly line inspector, R.L. Jones explained, this is not quality in the ordinary sense of good contrasted with bad, nor comparing what's serviceable with utterly unserviceable. The discussion assumes that conformance with specifications is the rule. Okay, so how to establish those specifications? The quality of telephone transmitters necessarily included the quality of transmitted speech, which could only be evaluated by a listener's ear. And as I'll explain, it's in these sets of specifications that we see how impairment easily is migrating back and forth between machines, signals, and humans in this, all of which are part of this telecommunication system. A Western Electric memo from 1918, now held in the AT&T archives, explains, we require, first of all, the definition and measurement of all the factors involved in telephonic quality. And secondly, we must know how to evaluate telephonic quality in commercial terms in order that it may be economically applied to the telephone plant. Conducting tests at first just on small groups of Western Electric employees, Crandall and Fletcher's group studied speech and hearing under different conditions with and without telephones to set tolerance limits for the caliber of future telephone sets. And their early research topics included these: determine energy distribution in the sounds of speech, analyze fundamental consonant and vowel sounds, measure loudness, relative importance to articulation of different frequency regions, relative sensitivity of the ear to different frequencies, effective interferences on quality. Now, if you're in sound studies, you know that this group basically overhauled everything about sound and took sound into the era of electroacoustics and changed the paradigm for understanding hearing and speech from musical models to electroacoustic ones. So I'm not going to talk about that in this talk, but this had ramifications far beyond the definition of impairment. So engineering efforts to measure loudness, quantify the relative sensitivity of the ear, and understand the effects of interferences on quality were completely interlinked. The impairments of attenuation, a telephone signal getting quieter as it moved along a telephone line, especially before electronic repeaters, which impacted loudness, and interference or noise, which masked intended speech transmission, impacted the ear in much the same way as what came to be called hearing loss. To understand these shared human and machine impairments, Western electric engineers produced a series of audiometers starting in 1922 with something they called the 1A, which was the first commercial electronic audiometer in the United States. Along with the 1A, they introduced, in fact, they named the audiogram as a means for plotting hearing function as the minimum volume required to hear each frequency in a given series of pure tones. Of course, there's so many other things that hearing function are, and I could spend all day critiquing the audiogram, but I don't have time to do that. The audiogram eventually included a reference 0, compiled from the averages of a large-scale national survey taken by AT&T in collaboration with the US Public Health Service. And then this allowed an individual's plot from the audiogram to be interpreted with regard to units of hearing loss from a norm. Indeed, the audiogram popularized the term hearing loss in English, which was a previously uncommon phrase. It took me like 10 years to understand that this was true. And there's a lot, hearing loss actually ends up coming out of this idea of transmission loss, and the decibel unit migrate, and the charts move right from transmission loss and attenuation into the audiogram. But again, that's also a different story. So the significance of the medical industrial complex to the discourse of impairment is really exemplified by this history of the audiogram. I've told parts of this story in an article in Grey Room, if you want more like historical detail about it. The audiogram created at AT&T was quickly taken up by the US Census, audiologists, deaf schools. It was internationalized. The reference 0 has been debated and changed over the years a lot. This audiogram offered a new set of physiological categories by which deafness was named and rated: mild, moderate, severe, and profound impairment, which define a person as a variant of an abstract population rather than evoking collectivity or identity, like something like deafness in the past did. Audiograms depict hearing impairment as an individual loss from a benchmark. Ranged along a continuum in this way, the deaf population profoundly shrank. And I'm not the first person to note that about the shrinking of deaf schools in the early 20th century. While the numbers of hearing impaired people available for rehabilitation profoundly expanded. In fact, at many moments there was, and even including today, there's been thought that there's like a hearing impairment epidemic for different reasons. In other words, a hearing impairment spectrum replaced the deaf hearing binary in the medical realm. Like the term continuum, a spectrum implies a continuous sequence. Yet this framework, either the continuum or spectrum framework, is inadequate to capture the diversity of deaf and hard of hearing experiences. This is why so many people use the term umbrella in different identity group categories, different identity groups, not the trans umbrella, the disability umbrella, rather than the spectrum and continuum. So audiometric categories of hearing impairment do not strictly correspond to identity. Depending on technology use and community membership, individuals with the same audiogram might identify quite differently as deaf, a cultural group defined by sign language, lowercase d deaf, late deafened, deafblind, hearing, hard of hearing. Okay, so I wish I had time to give you a full glossary of all the other impairments that spanned the human and machine elements of the telephone system beyond noise attenuation and interference and as hearing loss. For instance, overload was a term applied equally to human workers and to circuits, referring in the former case to telephone operators who were overburdened and hence inefficient, and in the latter to wires through which excessive current was passed, resulting in burnout or overheating. We've inherited the term information overload from this conjunction of overloaded electrical circuits and device operators. For now, I have to skip that glossary, things, crosstalk, monkey chatter, echo, there's just so many other impairments in there. And instead, I'll just conclude by emphasizing some of the stakes entailed in identifying this modern discourse of impairment, which came to encompass humans, machines, and signals alike, and still does. For one thing, those of us who research disability cannot simply rest our accounts of medicalization on medicine. In an article on capitalism and disability, Marta Russell and Ravi Malhotra have already pointed out that industrialization required a new sorting of disabled and non-disabled bodies. Industrial capitalism, they write, created not only a class of proletarians, but also a new class of disabled who did not conform to the standard worker's body and whose labor power was effectively erased, excluded from paid work. As a result, disabled persons came to be regarded as a social problem, and a justification emerged for segregating them out of mainstream life and into a variety of institutions. So taking this argument a step further, industrial medicine, and in the case of AT&T, industrial media systems defined and quantified specific physical impairments. I was shocked many years ago when I first realized that the audiogram came out of the telephone system. Why would that be? Shouldn't an otologist have come up with that? There were prior audiograms that, yes, of course, otologists worked on, but they didn't become institutionalized like this. Industrial media have equally minted new metaphoric impairments like overload. Moreover, impairment is as socially inflected, to return to my opening argument, as disability is understood to be, and new theories beyond the social model are now required for the field of disability studies. In a different register, the role of impairment in telephone engineering, at least in telephone engineering, also demands a slight correction to historian of technology Tom Hughes's theory of the reverse salient, which he defines as an area where the growth of technology is seen as lagging, a set of critical problems that, when solved, will correct the situation. Distinct from Hughes's theory of reverse salience as drivers of innovation in large-scale technological systems that can be solved, problems that can be solved, transmission impairments are understood to be omnipresent in telecommunications. They range from malfunctions and serious distortions to transient glitches. By the 1920s, telephone engineers had begun to see impairment as endemic to every stage of their calls and to all human hearers, with entropy and random noise in particular at the core of all physical systems. The impairment of noise remains, as a 2004 textbook on principle of digital communications networks states, the source of bread and butter for telecom engineers. If there were no noise, there would be no need for telecom engineers. So whether noise is reduced or harnessed to productive ends, the engineering paradigm is one of management rather than eradication. And then lastly, impairment and its management in telecommunications have required what has come to be called human factors engineering, with consequences for all of us who are media operators. Writing in 1998, former Bell Labs employee A. Michael Knoll commented on the need for physiological solutions to ubiquitous physical impairments in media systems. And I've been thinking a lot about what Kaushik said yesterday about surplus health, and wondering if there's something here to be said about surplus impairment or the value of impairment as a way that, perceivers are linked, perceivers with impairments can be linked to media systems so that the impairment of the media system is masked or hidden by the limitations of the listener or viewer. But this is a question that I can ask you during the Q&A. So he said transmission systems can't be perfect in the sense of limiting all forms of impairments. That would be far too costly. Instead, the design goal is to reduce their subjective effect on users to an acceptable level. So use the limitation of the user to have a limited machine. Hence, the human factors of transmission impairments, he writes, are an important consideration in the performance specifications for transmission systems. Impairment is required in the name of economy, in other words. Otherwise, the threats of noise, distortion, and attenuation demand constant management and could escalate into too high of costs. So I don't have time to talk about the history of the Human Factors Lab. Suffice to say that Western Electric is considered as one of the origins of that. I guess I don't have time to tell you all the different stakes of human factors engineering of impairments here. I'll just skip that too. There's a lot. I mean, different kinds of voices are considered to be impaired or are impaired by the telephone system. High-pitched voices, speakers in the American telephone system, speakers of tonal languages and Slavic languages at different times have had their voices impaired. There's a lot more to be said about that. So finally, the notion that impairment is inherent to the Constitution and performance of electronic media has undoubtedly also inflected lived practices of communication. John Durham Peters, professor of media studies at Yale, suggests that telecommunications are at once bridge and chasm, making an impediment of distance. The ideal of successful transmission, he writes, in Speaking into the Air, seems to have scaled from telegraphy, telephony, and radio across all human relations, installing a sense that there are obstacles of time and space between individuals. At the same time, I'm arguing successful transmission has always been compromised, seemingly dependent upon engineering. Efforts to control communication and eliminate impairment have caused the latter to manifest everywhere. Transmission impairments have been discovered at smaller scales, ceaselessly driving more engineering. So seeming to minimize impairment, communication engineering has often exacerbated it. I'll stop at that.
Hello, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to Adi and to Lucas for this invitation. It's not common for an early modernist to be invited to discuss political concepts, and so I'm really grateful for this chance to discuss a concept that somewhat permeates the period that I work on, the early modern period, and the colonial worlds that I move in, but usually that happens in a very tacit way. And so this opportunity has been very useful for me to try to put some ideas together and to try to see what traces of this concept we see, both in the early modern, but also in our very contemporary moment. So let me start by asking why should we care about this concept that, as the language it is spelled on, we have been told is mostly dead, right? Like Latin. And why should we care even about, its English iteration, the great chain of being, which according to its most celebrated theorist, Arthur Lovejoy, didn't survive evolutionary thought and started to thin out at the end of the 18th century, and surely by the mid-19th century was merely an afterthought. I want to join a series of people who think it's still important to question this concept, and in particular, I'm following Simon Schaffer in revisiting Lovejoy's treatment of the great chain of being and underlining that perhaps Lovejoy's most significant intervention in dealing with this concept and founding a field in the process has been to equate the means with the end. That is, to study seriality, to study series, to have series as the object of study, but at the same time to do that through seriality as a methodology. And he's reacting to, I think, the power of the notion of series in the history of science, but mostly in the history of science communication. He's reacting, I think, to very famous cases, like, for example, the Road to Homo sapiens depiction of evolution, very commonly known as the March of Progress from 1965, that, as we know, particularly in its abridged form, has become ubiquitous and tremendously parodied. I'll show you a couple of these very recent parodies. Or, my favorite. But as people like Stephen Jay Gould argued, the March of Progress is a straitjacket of linear advance because it equates evolution with progress, while, of course, life is a copiously branching bush, continually pruned by the Grim Reaper of extinction, not a ladder of predictable progress. So why should we talk about ladders again? What I suggest we do is to invite you to my period and to look at the most popular example, representation of this concept of the Scala Naturae, which actually was inspired by 16th century New Spain, 16th century Mexico, passed through Rome, and then was published in Perugia in 1579, and is at the moment the depiction of the concept in probably the most popular media that our students will consult. And after we spend some time in the 16th century, and I tell you a little bit about how this depiction of the Scala Naturae came to be produced, I am venturing into suggesting that there are vestiges of this concept still around us, and I will try to anchor this exposition by looking at two cases, by looking at the case of the Wari people in the Brazilian Amazon, and really riskily, American academia circa now. This is what the Scala Naturae looks like in 16th century New Spain. This depiction more or less summarizes the various traditions that came together in this concept probably at the height of its fame at this time period. We see that the Scala Naturae is basically a hierarchical organization of the world, not only of the terrestrial world, but by this time in the very Christian phase, and not only any Christian phase, this is the post-Reformation Christian phase, also includes the celestial world. We see that we have an organized hierarchy that goes from hell at the very bottom, we should start with hell, upwards to include inert matter, minerals, and then plants, and then terrestrial animals, and then fish, birds, humans, and all kinds of humans in different activities. If you zoom in really close, you can see, for example, that there are Franciscan missionaries in there in the picture showing natives of the New World the mysteries of the faith and hence helping them rise in the great chain of being. And then we get to the celestial sphere and we have different hierarchies of angels. And at some point I knew them all, but you can consult them in Aquinas. And then finally, God in its Trinitarian version, a depiction of the Trinity that was actually inspired by a Dürer engraving. And then somewhere in there we also see Mary on the left, kind of floating, not precisely part of the hierarchy, but very much part of the devotion that needed to be instructed through this type of product. We will come back to this image later, but let me tell you a little bit about how this was produced. This image is included in a book called Retórica Cristiana. And this book was written and engraved by a Franciscan missionary called Diego Valadez, who arrived in New Spain very, very young. He says that he arrived with his dientes de leche, which means his first teeth. He spent all his life in what is now Mexico, at the beginning in Tlaxcala, which was a very important mining town, and then was part of an evangelizing mission to the Chichimeca, which is the north. It's the frontier where only nomadic indigenous peoples lived and where it was very hard to set up missions. Then at some point, close to 40, I think he was 38, something like that, he went back to Europe, at the beginning to Madrid, tried to publish a couple of works. It is unclear exactly what happened and why he couldn't do that in Spain. There are different speculations, but he eventually made it to Rome and became a very central part of the evangelization efforts beyond Europe, particularly to Asia. It is very possible that this book is actually one of the tools, really, for evangelizing other peoples, taking the Mexican case as an example of what to do. This book includes many other engravings, famously a very European rendition of Mexico Tenochtitlan that is very famous amongst our historians, or an idealized version of what a Franciscan convent would look like, and everything that should happen in that convent, including the administration of all the different sacraments, and notoriously a Franciscan church resting upon the 12 first Franciscan missionaries who came to the New World, known as the famous 12, the church literally resting on their backs. Or an example that you might have seen before, a depiction of how Franciscan missionaries would teach Christian doctrine through images, basically responding to how indigenous peoples communicated visually, had a visual epistemology, and conveyed their own traditions and memory through paintings. So it was a novel way, an adaptative way to teach Christian doctrine, to produce images that then would be described by the preacher and hopefully be understood by the natives. Now, let's get to some of the elements that are there included in that depiction of the Scala Naturae. And I'm summarizing very, very abruptly, and I apologize to any medievalist in the house, but let me just underline two main traditions that come together in this engraving. One is the concentric idea of the cosmos, and this is, of course, a 15th century rendition of ideas that came together through probably 1,500 years of history. So we're getting the very last slice of that story. But to summarize, this notion included an organization of the sublunar world, the terrestrial world, according to the four elements, starting with earth, and then water, and then air, and then fire. And then fire would somewhat touch with a supralunar region, where we would find two other elements, ether, and they're the Empyrean, which at some point was a creation to accommodate the biblical version of the creation of the world, to accommodate Genesis to Aristotelian philosophy. So the Empyrean would be where all the celestial bodies would inhabit. Then the notion of Scala, the notion of the ladder, is also very famous, and it has an antecedent again in Genesis through this story of Jacob's ladder, where Jacob has this dream that God teaches him how to reach heaven and how to, I think, free himself of his brother Esau, if I'm not mistaken, through ascending this ladder by being virtuous. So there is a biblical antecedent there. And then this notion that there is, that the ladder is a symbol of moral edification and ascent, gets taken by various intellectuals, in particular Ramon Lull, who equates that spiritual rise to higher intellectual qualities. And so we have here that, again, starting with stones and then fire, plants, beasts, man, and then celestial beings, there is an ascending order, but this time it refers to the intellect, to different intellectual capacities that rise as well with how matter is purer and purer. Now I want to take you in a different direction. There's an element in this depiction of the Scala Naturae, and perhaps we should be reminded of that image. And I'm sorry, but I'm missing one more slide depicting this so that we didn't have to do this. But what I want to attract your attention to now is not so much how this is, kind of a series of concentric circles or, organized somewhat in a ladder way, although this actually is probably the clearest representation of this being a chain as well, because as you can see, there is a literal chain that is being held by God and goes all the way down to holding the devil by the neck, okay? But there is much more happening here, because this is not only a hierarchical picture of how the cosmos is organized, it is not only a fixed picture, This is also a sort of flux diagram of a moral but also a material economy that is going on here. And you will see that to the right there are these figures that are falling. So this is a representation of how the soul can fall and becomes more and more imperfect as it falls through the scale. But then we also have another series of images to the left that have been interpreted in very different ways. For a long time, we thought that these were seals, the seals of the Council of the Indies, the colonial institution behind the Spanish imperial enterprise. But it turns out they are not. They are actually coins. They are representations of Mexican silver coins, coined between 1536 and 1572, so the first silver coins coined in the New World, that are depicted in ascending value. So, in a way, they are showing how ascent was monetarized, but they are also showing, I think, something much broader. They are, in some ways, summarizing what the imperial project was about. That is, justifying the perfection of matter through evangelization. Here I am relying on a very recent book by a colleague in our field called Orlando Betancourt, The Matter of Empire, Metaphysics and Mining in Colonial Peru. This is not an easy book, but I highly recommend that you read it. What Betancourt is doing here is arguing for the Spanish imperial project as relying on a metaphysical framework that assumed that the natural world was composed of raw and effective material that had to be dominated from above and directed toward a higher end. So in a way, what Spanish colonists were doing in the New World was helping matter fulfill its telos, manipulating matter to make it purer and purer. Now let's think about that for a second with regards to our depiction there. You saw that those coins were basically coming from hell, right? And so connecting this metaphysics to mining is at the core of this book. It is saying that mining was a project that was somewhat asked for by matter in the New World because it had the mission to be perfected. And of course, energy was needed to produce this transformation. Hands were needed to produce this transformation. So this justification, which Orlando Betancourt terms metaphysical instrumentalism, is also very linked to slavery and to indenture in the New World. It is not neutral. It is definitely not an idea. In Lovejoy's terms, it is a located and very material representation of the world. One last point I want to do about that silver coin. This is also a story, a representation of a historical moment that not only brings the Spanish imperial project forward, but that connects the world in very specific ways, because as many of you in this room know, it is Mexican silver and Peruvian silver that finally complete this first globalization, at least according to some economic historians like Flynn and Giraldes, who say that it is precisely in the year 1571, that is with the foundation of Manila in the Philippines, of course called after Philip II, King of Spain, that the world becomes united. And it is Mexican silver, which will start passing through Manila on its way to China, that finally unites the world commercially. So what we see in that depiction, including these Mexican coins, is also a product of the future evangelization, a project, for the future evangelization of the world that is looking to Asia. And remember, this is basically the product of a Franciscan who spent his life in Mexico, is coming back to Rome, and is in Rome at the moment when the Counter-Reformation project is being redesigned. And so this is basically a manual for that next step, for taking the truth to the next geography. Now, I promised that I thought there were some vestiges of the Scala Naturae still among us, and I will not call them seriality or history of seriality. I will turn them differently. I will talk about the notion of oneness as it relates to truth, I mean, to this notion that there is one truth, and also about teleological thinking. And I will start by talking about the Brazilian Amazon and one particular case that has really struck me recently. And this is a work of an anthropologist that I really respected, Aparecida Vilaça, who gave the inaugural Levi-Strauss lecture for this Journal of Ethnographic Theory, I hope I am pronouncing it correctly, about the Wari people with whom she has worked for more than 30 years. I think she first started working with them in '86. The Wari are one of these Amazonian groups which have been contacted very recently. I think it has been only 4 years. And Aparecida Vilaça has followed that contact history and has been studying what evangelization does in contemporary Brazil. And her latest paper is about numbers. It is about counting and what is entailed in numbers. And her point, or one of her many points, it's a brilliant paper, I'll also suggest you read it, is that the Wari don't count starting from number 1. Number 1 does not exist, or didn't, in Wari language. They start counting by number 2. They started with duality, or with relation. Number 1 didn't exist, and as she started working with them, Vilaça realized what to them 1 was ultimate solitude, loneliness. This is not something that is desirable. And so the way they organized the world started with number 2. When they were evangelized and they were taught that number 1 was really the beginning of things and also kind of the aim of the new set of beliefs that were being taught, kind of reaching that notion of a truth, a celestial truth, a one God, kind of remember Dürer. They needed to get there to that Dürer engraving. What they did was basically move that dual concept of 2 to the Christian notion of hell. So basically they started understanding when they were being told 1 is really how you should start organizing the world, then that notion of duality was moved to the underworld, which to them didn't really matter much. It was not a bad place. It was just somewhere, a place to accommodate that concept that was so central to them, to not discard it. And I'm, again, oversimplifying this very, very complex and beautiful argument, but the point is that 1 didn't exist, and that 1 was introduced, the notion of oneness. Okay? Now, we have very recently heard from the recently elected president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, this very striking phrase, where there is indigenous land, there is wealth underneath it. So you can imagine what types of connections I am making here. This, again, is not a neutral idea. This idea is becoming something. It's transforming places, it's transforming people, and it will continue to do so. Now, I want to end by talking about how the notion of atelos has been taking center stage among us. Maybe some of you have come across this lecture. It has circulated very widely. A lecture called Two Incompatible Sacred Values in American Universities by Jonathan Haidt, given at Duke 2 years ago. I think it's October 6, 2016. It has been watched by almost 150,000 people, a little bit more disliked than liked, apparently. But it holds, I think, a message that we need to pay attention to. And again, I don't want to oversimplify 66 minutes of lecture, but I want to focus on this. Hyde expresses that in the last 20 years, left-leaning academic professors have increased from 2 to 1 in American universities to 5 to 1. That is what is depicted here. And in his view, the political diversity that existed and is being lost implies that what he calls institutionalized disconfirmation, that is the idea that within your own institution, you will get the pushback necessary to help you clarify your ideas and basically be debated against, is being lost. If there is no political diversity in his view, then we're all thinking the same and we are not being pushed towards the truth. Now, the way this works, I think, for him is equating political diversity with, curricular and curricular diversity, let's put it that way. And I wonder whether that is the case, and fear that our history shows that it is precisely the opposite. And that political heterogeneity, as he would term it, actually has meant epistemic homogeneity. And I will leave it there. I just would like to end by asking, just imagining, if I were an undergrad, and this is something that he poses as a rhetorical question, you undergrads now need to know what type of institution you would be getting into. One that is pursuing truth as its telos, and he gives examples of this. The most prominent example is Chicago for him, or institutions that are pursuing social justice as its telos. And as you can imagine, we are the example for that, Brown is. So think about that, he says to the students. Decide, be informed before you choose what type of institution you will join. But I would dare ask, well, if I were an undergrad, I would want to know that the wari started to count with number 2, instead of learning that in the not so distant past they used to. With that, I will end.
My question is for Iris. Do you pronounce your first name like that? Iris?
Iris.
Iris
Yes.
Montero.
Gracias.
Por supuesto. This is fascinating. You are opening a whole new world. That's precisely the case to me. And I would like to ask you very naively methodological or epistemological question about the understanding of the function of teleologies and teleological images of the world in our culture. Now, the story of the question of the Scala Naturae or chain of being that you are telling us takes people like me, my age, my intellectual training and formation, into a direction that is wholly heterogeneous with the one I used to know, because ideas of the chain of being as they were systematized in natural history in the 18th century in Europe, and leading, of course, to, I will not repeat that, say to Teilhard de Chardin in the 20th century. I have been accustomed to think not that this has a single intellectual root or starting point, but that one of the crucial backgrounds to take into account is the Neoplatonic tradition, particularly as it was exposed in a grand manner by Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, especially Cudworth and etc. So your genealogy is so completely heterogeneous. I mean, it's political, theological as well, of course, but in another sense, and cultural. So do you think that we must choose? It's a naive question. I mean, one way or the other of discussing this question, which has, of course, anthropological implications, or do you think that there is any possibility of articulating them?
Thank you for that. I am definitely not trying to build a genealogy.
Excuse me.
I am not trying to build a genealogy. In fact, I think that would be, if you know, I could call this a critique. This is still very, very preliminary work. I'm trying to argue against a genealogy. I'm trying to understand, on the contrary, how key elements of this concept have been manifested in certain contexts. And in that sense, to me, it has been useful. But I do think as a historian, and I think part of how I have delineated this story, in particular the last huge jump to our contemporary world and focusing on this notion of telos, pretty much has to do, in my opinion, with the faults of philosophy, a deeply genealogical discipline. And it is, it is there in that lecture, you know, always the allure to Aristotle and going back to kind of the principles of the discipline and looking for authority and going back to the principles of the discipline. But that, to me, immediately sets a frame that leaves big chunks of the world outside. And I know this is a big claim, but what I'm trying to do is connect, you know, some very key elements of what this concept used to entail in a particular moment in history that I know of, and say, well, this idea, when materialized, is definitely not an idea, but it is actually at the core of the structures that created the colonial world and that somewhat still organize the world. I hope I'm, yeah.
Rebecca. And
then... this is a question that might be answered by both, but it is sort of immediately prompted by some of the images that Iris displayed, and also a meditation on the earlier session. So it's really asking you both to comment on the role of time and simultaneity and progression of time in your analyses. And I was thinking for Mara especially, where does this idea of, in talking about signal and noise, where there's the analysis of lag, of time lag between processing of information, what role does that play into it and into the idea of impairment? Because when I was looking at the images, that the main one that you were displaying, Iris, is it's a progression, but it's also there's a simultaneity there in it's a representation of a cosmological truth at the same time. So there's and I would love to hear you articulate in the way that you can better than I the complexity of that duality.
Would you like to start, Mara?
I mean, time. Such a big question. I thought you were going to ask, I thought when you started with time, you were going to ask the, are we always historicizing question? But then you asked me instead a very specific question about time lag. I mean, time lag generates echo. Yes, that's a transmission impairment. That's like the easiest answer to that. But where else does time manifest? I mean, I guess Laura's not here today, is she? I do kind of want to think about this question of her question about are we historicizing or doing something else? Are some of these concepts universal? Or if not universal, are they somehow modular and move around? Maybe this is what you're saying. And when I think about this concept that I've chosen is such a recent word in English that in a way I think it's just part of the long now. And if you think about these large-scale technological systems, you know, my colleague Nicole Staroselsky has written about the history of internet cables today and how a lot of them are either made of the same components or laid along the same lines as telegraph cables in the 19th century. And so, you know, in a way, this concept, we're still in the present of this machine. You know, the passage of time according to a human lifespan is quite different than that for some of these large systems. The only other thing I would say about time, I mean, I answered your question with the time lag echo thing, but the only other thing I'd say about time and impairment is just, of course, which lots of disability studies scholars have said, is that normal aging has been redefined as impairment. So, you know, I mean, impairment could be just reframed as just something like variation. And if you're in a statistical universe, ideally variation would be neutral and it would be typical. It would just be the state of things. But maybe it is some weird element of the great chain of being that one always has to re-hierarchize these variations into kinds of impairments or losses. That's not temporal, though.
And I would just say, I was thinking also time lag in a way links back to your comments about the birth of these systems in ideas about labor and functionality in labor, because that brings with it an idea about the speed with which laborers should act or not act, and therefore, yeah, so.
Yeah, and syncing everyone up to machine time. I mean, syncing is very important.
That is a great question. I think that is partly why this particular rendition of the Scala Naturae has been interpreted in so many different ways, including by Valadez himself. So Valadez describes this as in different ways in his own book. He says this is an image of creation. But then why are the silver coins there, right? And why are, you know, many New World things there as well? We have, you know, this is too small for you to see, but we have a maize plant over here, and we have maguey, and we have other New World crops. This is, I think, best described as a representation both of a worldview and of an imperial project. And again, you know, because context matters, we cannot divorce the image from the context and purpose for which it was produced. So to me, the fact that it is accompanied by all these other depictions, and there are around 40 illustrations in this book, I only showed you 5, but the others are, you know, about sins, for example, about bigamy. How do you condemn bigamy? Or about mnemonics, actually, how to teach people to remember prayers, and or how to help missionaries learn indigenous languages. I mean, this is a huge intellectual project. But to me, it is very telling that at the very center of this is this notion of the world that also needed to be instructed. It needed to be clear. Let me give you an example of how this looked from the other side. We have a 16th century codex produced more or less around this time. Its final version is thought to be from 1577 in Mexico, which is basically a New World rendition of Pliny's natural history. So it's adapting Pliny to the New World and taking on that kind of inquiry about New Spain. So basically gathering information about everything from their history to how they organize socially, their gods, obviously their religion, their rhetoric, and the natural world. In the book on the natural things, the prologue, written by another Franciscan missionary, a colleague of Valadez, stated very clearly that the purpose of this book was to teach native peoples the proper order of things, because they tended to call animals gods. And that was clearly wrong. There is only one God. And so crucial in that transformation was teaching the scale, right?
Kosh, and then Laura.
So I had a question for Mara, but before that, just a quick anecdote. I was wondering if you're in conversation with the French anthropologist Emilia Sanabria, because she's just beginning a project on ayahuasca, and when your New York Times people were there, she was also there in the Brazil-Peru border, and she wants to study this appropriation. But when they went there, they had to take plastic water bottles because the water there is so toxic from mining pollutants that. So Mara, my question for you is utterly speculative and unfair because it's moving away from your concept in some way. But I was thinking of the stakes. I mean, it's an incredible paper. And I was thinking of the question of the relationship between individual and collective biomedical/political subjectivity in your story, right? So that, the story that you're telling, the story that you're telling about the relations between workers' comp and individual debility, right, are happening as counterpart to a potentially more and more medicalized notion of disability, which forms the basis of imagining a collective subject of rights and disability rights activism, right? And while you were speaking, I couldn't help thinking about something that I know very little about, but I'm very interested in now, which is the politics of mining in South Africa, right? And there's a 20th century history of workers' compensation in South Africa, which has separate regulations for mine workers compared to all other kinds of industrial workers, that exists coterminous with a 20th century epidemiology of phthisis, what is now called silicosis, right? And the public health develops pretty much alongside the development of workers' comp. Mm-hmm. And now you have a politics of tuberculosis, which on the one hand is a biosocial politics in the image of politics of access to antiretrovirals under the sign of HIV, AIDS, and so on. But on the other hand, is getting scripted through the courts, where it's all about the history of mine workers' compensation and the epidemiology of phthisis, right? So you have one kind of legal trajectory of TB politics that's all about industrial capitalism, and this other trajectory that's all about biosociality, right? And then you had a silicosis class action suit, which was also for TB patients, which was South Africa's first major class action suit. So what one is seeing then is this sort of disaggregation of an older notion of class struggle into, on the one hand, a biosocial struggle, what Paul Rabinow would call biosociality, and on the other hand, a disaggregation of what John and Jean Komaroff say, class struggle into class action, right? And I'm wondering if, so neither of this breaks down the possibility of collective action, but it reconfigures and disaggregates it in different kinds of ways, right?
I might just let Mara
answer. And so just to sort of turn that into a question, I'm wondering, first of all, are there legal histories of disability activism and workers' compensation coming together in your story, and if so, would that matter? And secondly, how to think about these reconfigurations and disaggregations in domains across, say, US telecom and South African mining. And finally, to sort of push you on the gender dimensions of this, because I'm thinking about the figure of the telephone operator alongside the mine widow, who's absolutely central to the politics.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I mean, the question of how collectives form around disability or around impairment is such a complicated one, because a single person might belong to two collectives at once. One might, whether we're talking about the 1920s in the US or now, someone could say, I'm blind and I'm disabled, and feel that one is at once in both of those collectives. And so biosociality is an important concept in disability studies. Some of the collectives are biosocial. Lots of collectives are very similar to what Kristen Herring describes, technosociality with her ham radio book. Lots of people are like, I'm a cochlear implant user. There's identities that form around technology use. The sort of big collective of disability, which is probably been the one that, it was a late-ish civil rights movement, and it was, Simi Linton has written a lot about this in her book Claiming Disability. It's taking a category that is a modern category that's about exclusion from work, and then deciding not to get rid of it, but to take this category that has a negative in it, disability, and just reclaim it for other purposes. It's a coalitional category of people who may seem to have nothing to do with one another, someone with epilepsy, someone who's blind, someone with Down syndrome, and saying, no, we are all united. That tends to have more of the language of class struggle attached to it, and it's a later 20th century phenomenon. There are so many other things to say about this. I feel pressured to relinquish the microphone. No, okay. The gendered aspects, there's this amazing 800-page book about overwork by Josephine Goldmark from the early 20th century, quite a lot of which is about telephone operators. So it would take a long time to answer the question of the gendered dimensions of this, even just within a gigantic corporation like AT&T. There was a real division of what kind of disabilities were proper to men and proper to women in the earlier 20th century, which has changed quite a bit, obviously, since then. I'm not sure that in a pithy way I can connect what's happening in 1920s US to what's happening in South African mining now. I'm not sure, did you want to maybe clarify the question?
No, but just, longer conversation, but just thinking aloud about collectivity based on industrial histories,
yes,
alongside collectivity based,
yes,
on, say, biopolitics.
Yes. Or a use of a technological object. Yeah. Some of these are quite seemingly small, or being institutionalized. There's a collectivity of at a moment in time where people who were placed into what were called idiots asylums suddenly all began to be known as people with idiocy, even though, again, it was previously a complete miscellany of phenomena or conditions. And that, of course, that has some relationship to class, but that wouldn't have been how that collective saw itself at the time, or defined itself, because it's against one's will that one is placed in that place and then comes to identify. So it's actually it is a complicated story, and that's a very weak way to end, but I'll just say many people had belonged to multiple collectivities at once of different scales, and some had to do with class and class struggle, and some didn't.
There's information question for you if you wanted to answer that.
Sorry, I think I missed that.
That's all right. That's all right. That's fine. We'll just move to Noah.
Thanks much for both papers. I wanted to ask you both about how you think about political economy. So in Iris's case, Valadez is obviously doing this very complicated thing of justifying, as a hybrid figure himself, the extractive economic structures that Christianity is going to facilitate. That's the crude way of putting it. And I'm wondering how you think of that economic feature. And in Mara's case, I wanted to ask you about, in the contemporary environment that you were just talking about, you made this really suggestive comment that one of the reasons that that one could just think of impairment as a spectrum, and yet people don't. And I'm wondering if you think that has to do with the fact that the disability rights movement, broadly speaking, remains an economically redistributive project. And ought to be, I'm not criticizing that, but I'm wondering if that's part of the reason that one can't adopt in practical terms the model that says, well, there's human variability across the range, because that would not lead us to a robust conclusion about how redistribution should happen. So those are my questions.
You want to start? Or, okay. That is a question, isn't it? I will try to answer with a very located answer as well, because I think in cases. And I'm Mexican, so I will answer with an example from home. Maybe many of you know that we have a new president, a left-leaning president, who has this phrase: "For the sake of all, the poor people first." He just took possession last Saturday. We have absolutely no idea how this thing will pan out. Very likely, in 6 or 12 years, we might have a Brazil situation on our hands and a reversal of that type of program. But the idea behind it and the reason why he finally won after 3 attempts to win the presidency is that clearly, for Mexico at least, the neoliberal model had created such levels of inequality that crime, what we will call the drug problem, the number of people disappearing, violence against journalists, I mean, all these problems have escalated to a degree that make I would say the kind of the hierarchical order inoperable. To give a very concrete example, it is not safe anymore to drive a fancy car because you immediately become a target. And if you cannot show your wealth, then why do you want it for? This is, of course, the mentality of some of our leaders. It becomes a non-purpose. So finally, because inequality is so huge, it kind of makes sense to redistribute. It's still, because of selfish reasons, but the point of wealth starts to become just pointless with such social decomposition.
I mean, the disability and redistribution question I can answer, and then I'll say something about how I think about political economy vis-a-vis AT&T at that moment, because AT&T, of course, is still with us, still a Fortune 500 company. It's weathered many changes in politics and economy. It was one of the movers that, if one believes that we have moved from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, it was one of those IT firms that helped that happen. So it's hard to just make an umbrella statement about AT&T and political economy, but the disability issue, this is addressed in Sarah Rose's book, which is that, the ADA has done almost nothing to solve the issue of disability and unemployment, even though in the popular press it seems like it has done something. So after workers' comp laws became nationally regulated, so that would be after companies like AT&T voluntarily instated some of them, 20% of people with disabilities suddenly became unemployed, which was never true before, and that number is the same today. So there's still that many people, and the footnotes on this are all in Sarah's book. Before that time, people with certain kinds of disabilities would have been taken care of by things like pensions, which stopped existing in the US, or charity, or they just were in the workforce. And Sarah has a lot of documentation about how lots of people with disabilities were able to work before workers' comp and were incorporated onto assembly lines and in all sorts of different modes of industrial labor. So she makes a very strong argument in her book about how workers' comp created an unemployment problem, and actually even something like the ADA hasn't solved it, hasn't resulted in real redistribution. The question of political economy, when I think about the early 20th century with AT&T, of course, I basically just try to work with the categories that the actors are using, and then try to, so many of them are stereotypes, of course, that we've inherited. I mean, many people who work on AT&T lament the fact that, AT&T has written the history, and then often historians just it's like working on Google would be 100 years from now. There's a deluge of, stuff coming out of this gigantic corporation, which we just parrot back.
People might be using n-grams to analyze.
Sad. That will be very sad. That's going to happen, and that's sad. Yeah, but something like efficiency. Of course, AT&T was promoting the efficiency paradigm of American economy in the early 20th century, but what they really meant by efficiency was a whole series of internally conflicting things, and everything was about trade-offs. I mean, efficiency, they could be talking about speed or quantity of material or number of human laborers or costs, and so actually it was just a series of trade-offs internally of lots of different kinds of efficiencies. There's no such thing as efficiency with a capital E, even if that company was saying, yes, this is what's happening in the 20s with our assembly lines or with our, the way we're building our network across the nation. So I tend to try to unpack the categories that they have given us about what they think was happening in US industry then and figure out and of course there's always just lots and lots of internal debate and conflict and trade-off happening.
Barbara.
This is sort of a reflection sparked by Iris's paper, but it's also open for comment by Mara as well, and that is that the great chain of being, it seems to me, continues to live in the American Academy, and it is reflected most explicitly in the work of E.O. Wilson and the idea of the unity of knowledge, but it is also reflected tacitly in the hierarchy of prestige. It's significant for Mara because she, in a way, her field is off the ladder and is a question of a certain classical ladder. But as we know, this ladder goes up and down. On top, closest to truth, mathematics, then physics, then biology. So we have seen this, with language teaching usually at the bottom along with piano teaching. And then you invert that ladder in order to get the reductionism, which was also a different way of relating the disciplines, what reduces to what, and there what was on top becomes that which is most foundational. Mm-hmm. So among other things to think about are different kinds of dynamics. These ladders have an implicit motion to them. You talked about the up and down, but of course there's different ways in which they can be related to one another. Yeah. And just finally, part of what I was suggesting yesterday in talking about scientism was, just to question that whole notion of both intellectual history that underwrites that and the notion about what the relations would be among different kinds of knowledges. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, I completely agree with you, and I think that's partly why I want to start reading this image precisely as a flux diagram. It is about going up and down, and it is about actually how to go up. You need to go down, and this is where the extracting ideology gets inserted, what Garcia Marquez would call kind of the mineral folly. Because you need to go to the underworld to extract, literally, in this context. And it is only through that process of going to the underworld with what that entails symbolically that matter can start to ascend, and with it also souls. So this is a dynamic model, definitely. And I think one way to explain it would be also to talk about all those intermediary models, the Neoplatonics, which, yes, basically focus on these ladders which have a value or a virtue on each step. So there is a very organized way of ascending. There are very particular behaviors that can get you up and down, right? And to come back to this example, this organizes everything. One of the other engravings in this book is the hierarchy of the disciplines. Of course, as happened with every manual, and we have grammar at the very beginning, and we have theology at the very top. So yes, I agree.
I'm not sure I have a comment on that.
Adi?
This is a little playful question. It includes Etienne, so all three of you. I would like to ask you if we can speak about the chain of being and about the interaction between technology and biopolitics, and in Mara's case, in terms of an environment. We have one big environment and one small environment. Would you agree with your concept of environment to think about these two presentations in terms of environmental terms? There are unbounded beings. They are not entirely autonomous. What is important is the relationship between them. What is problematized? What should be problematized? Not in the presentation itself, but when you think about it reflectively, is how we, in our understanding of the environment, bound the environment itself. So, this is the question.
I would rather hear what Mara and Iris think. I guess I would just say, I mean, to me, like Mara, listening to your talk, I was thinking a little bit about environments and media environments as well. And what to me is so interesting, also thinking of John Durham Peters' work, is how the media environment gets collapsed in a lot of that work into just signal engineering, right? As opposed to the broader kind of context in which a certain kind of bodily capability becomes marked as impaired or not. And so it seems to me like the engineers themselves are setting a bound on what counts as like a legitimate environment, right, to subject to engineering. I don't know, and this, I don't know. I think I would actually much rather hear what you guys have to say about that than what I do.
I mean, if we taking environment to be the environment like outside of the factory, something that the physical or so-called natural world is part of. And of course, what telephone engineers wanted to do was canalize it. I mean, to create channels all through the air and water and land through which signals could be sent without corruption. I mean, that was the project. It was to seal off, to take messages and turn them into something that wouldn't be transformed. You know, each of you is hearing my voice in a different way because it's moving to you through space in different ways. You hear in different ways. You're sitting in different positions. But the point was to try to protect the signal as it would leave and have it land exactly as it left. So the environment was a problem, and other people's bodies were also environmental problems in a way for signal reception. But in terms, if we take environment to mean like even the social environment, the whole point of the social model of disability is to say that disability and impairment really just are, come about or are defined in particular social settings. And so this question of human variation, of course, problematic variation, variation becomes problematic in a particular social, architectural, and economic setting. That is the argument of disability studies. That's the main argument of disability studies. And I think, yeah, John Durham Peters, he's written a lot now about like clouds, and he has moved into different things as media. I think production and labor are really missing from a lot of media studies work now. It certainly was missing from a lot of the early work that I was doing. And when I really dug into some of the archives, I was surprised at how much concern engineers had for manufacturing and production, even as they were thinking about end users. They were testing a lot of things on themselves and on people on assembly lines, and they were taking an assembly line logic, an inspector logic. I mean, there's so many amazing phrases from quality control begins with Walter Sheward at AT&T, and he was a sort of poetic genius of something as boring as quality control, and he often said things like, we are all inspectors now, and this inspection logic moves from the land of production to to communication itself and to the end user. So I think the environment of manufacturing, labor, production is, if we can call it an environment, rather than just a setting, is really missing from media studies. But the bigger question of like the natural environment was a problem.
Actually, this reminds me that you mentioned Thomas Hughes, yes. Right? And Hughes's model of technological systems relied on a very strong system-environment distinction, right? And so he talks a lot about how disruptions, interruptions, noise, interference, right, gets or resources, right, get incorporated into a system, yes. Engineered into a system. But I think in his imagination there was a very, very bounded system that could grow or shrink, but always had a clear line around it. And that line was tight integration and kind of engineered integration. And so I thought it was really interesting that you suggested that impairment is a permanent condition, right? It never gets engineered out. It never gets pushed outside of the system, and it never gets brought all the way into the system in a way that allows it to be totally controlled. But it remains this sort of constant, I don't know, irritation or disruption or blurriness at the edge of the system. And that seems like an important revision to Hughes's understanding of environments.
Bruce, would you like comments?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, well, the way I would phrase it would be, what is it exactly the difference between nature and the environment? I mean, what nature as it is dealt with in this period and environment as Etienne has charted it. And they definitely have a lot in common, but I think, it would be God. The difference is killing God, I think. Taking God out of the notion of nature.
If we take the image seriously, then God is just an element in the picture.
Sorry, I didn't.
If we take the image,
yes.
the leading image of your talk, then one of the striking things is that God is in the picture.
No, I mean between nature and the environment. Yes, exactly. God is there in nature in this model, but by this moment, when we start seeing the notion of environment as it has been charted, it is no longer metaphysical.
Well, just another environment. Why, if we, I think Joanna invoked ancestors, right? It was part of the environment, right?
Well, it depends. I was thinking, during your talk of Zoe Todd's work on fossil ancestors, and I think that she's writing from the perspective, from a kind of Métis, indigenous, environmental, legal, anthropological perspective, trying to make sense of a different way into problems of environment or climate, and thinking, I was very struck by the idea of moving matter, towards its redemption. And she's got a sort of inverse sort of critique saying that digging up these ancestors, like these minerals are our ancestors, right? And digging up these minerals is actually a kind of, there's a violence in the way in which we are seeking to make violate different kinds of relations. And so I don't know if it's, I think it matters too, like the metaphysical is itself something that needs to be kind of reckoned with and negotiated, and all of this, even like the idea of the noosphere, which makes you think of like, it's Teilhard de Chardin is advancing this too, Catholic priest evolution. So I think you put your finger on something that is worth thinking about, and I think also points us to the need to be thinking science, the relation between science and religion, yes, really differently than has been traditionally cast.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, we meet again at 1:40.
And all are invited for lunch. And just before we go to eat, I just want to say that some of you thanked Lucas and me, and Lucas and me thank Leela, Gandhi, and Team Booth, who are part of the organizing committee, just for the record.